Hello and welcome to Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. All opinions, rants, and tunes are my own. Nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical or political advice. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. If you're interested in learning more, have an idea for a future topic, or just want to tell me I'm wrong, you can follow the show on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod, Instagram at drug_cultures, or shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. What is a drug? The question may sound pedantic or meaningless or obvious depending on your perspective. The concept of a drug in the sense that it's used now, as in drug abuse, drug-fueled, or drug culture, is a fairly modern concept, and whose definition is constantly in flux. Is heroin a drug? I think most of us would probably say, obviously. Is cannabis a drug? I would argue yes, it seems to tick most of the boxes. It's psychoactive, it's inebriating, has a long history of prohibition, and seems to have health consequences if abused. But there's an army of stoners, many of whom listen to this podcast, who would probably disagree. They'd say it's an ancient plant that has no lethal overdose potential, limited ability to be physically addictive, and that the only reason to call it a drug is to associate its users with those who use other, much more dangerous substances, dangerous both to the user and perceived danger to society as a whole. What about coffee? Plenty of people who hate drugs and drug users with a passion still enjoy a strong cup of coffee every morning and are able to compartmentalize their own use of a psychoactive substance. It's really impossible to find a unifying answer to that question, what is a drug, that correctly categorizes everything and can be universally applied. There's plenty of medical definitions of drugs, sure, but if applied universally, those might lump general anesthesia for surgery in with crack cocaine. Not that useful for the purposes of this show. What I want to do for this episode is something a bit unusual. I want to bring into being a political definition of drugs. Because drugs around the world have served this very important political purpose as a tool for promoting a creeping authoritarianism under the guise of science, social cohesion, or public health. A drug, to a state or country that hopes to regulate it, is a substance or plant whose production, distribution, or consumption can be regulated or restricted for political gain. And once something is widely seen as a drug, that usually means there's a cultural consensus that its use ought to be controlled or even prohibited altogether, which gives power structures one more tool to enforce whatever agenda they already wanted to enforce. That's why as long as we've had drug control paradigms, we've had selective enforcement that disproportionately targets minority or disadvantaged communities. You see it in the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. You see it in any objective analysis of marijuana arrests, where black people are 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana, despite similar rates of use. You see it in any map of police activity where cops are sent to poor, predominantly black neighborhoods, ostensibly to reduce or prevent violent crime, but end up dramatically over-policing drug use relative to affluent white neighborhoods. And you see it not just in America, but around the world, such as in Thailand, where if you listen to our episode on Kratom, you'll know that Thai drug laws have been extensively and often brutally weaponized by the country's Buddhist majority against its Muslim, ethnically Malay minority. Today we're going to be talking about the policies of a country that has been in the news a lot recently, Israel. Specifically, we're going to be talking about its policy of prohibiting the picking of 2 culturally important plants, za'atar and akkoub. It's a policy that perfectly lines up in so many ways with drug prohibitions around the world, with one critical difference. Neither plant is psychoactive or inebriating in any way. Yet Israel, through its strict anti-foraging laws and selective enforcement of these laws, has turned them both into drugs. I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is Drug Cultures, we'll be right back. Starting in 2018, researchers began observing what took place when Israelis and Palestinians took ayahuasca together. For those of you who haven't listened to episode 3 of this podcast, which I highly recommend you do, ayahuasca is the potent psychedelic brew used for centuries in the Amazon as part of various cultural ceremonies for everything from group and individual healing to divination predicting the future, and even purportedly for warfare. For the purposes of these initial sessions between Israelis and Palestinians, they were ostensibly apolitical. The purpose of the sessions were primarily for psycho-spiritual growth of the individual and had nothing to do with peace building. Nevertheless, the scientists were very interested in whether the revelations produced by the ayahuasca experience might be applicable to the process of bridging the divide between Israelis and Palestinians. Specifically, they wanted to see whether ayahuasca insights might help participants gain a better understanding of the ways in which they're similar and different from each other, and the true nature of the conflict. Quickly, it became clear that yes, these sessions were deeply transformative for the individuals who took part and helped them humanize the other. Israeli participants reported sobbing and hugging the Palestinians who were alongside them for the ceremonies, and participants of both groups often reported the release of long-held trauma. And as these ceremonies went on, the researchers, an Israeli named Lior Roseman and a Palestinian named Sami Awad, started to focus on studying whether ayahuasca ceremonies with the explicit intention of fostering peace building might be effective for Palestinian and Israeli ayahuasca users with conflict-related trauma. It's a really fascinating area of research, and it's ongoing. Journalists and scientists are tracking how these initiatives have changed in the wake of the Hamas attacks on October 7th of last year and Israel's ongoing siege and genocide in the Gaza Strip. If you're interested in learning more about it, I highly recommend you check out the podcast Altered States. They're a great new podcast out of UC Berkeley's Center for the Science of Psychedelics, and they did a great episode about these ceremonies, their tremendous promise, and also, of course, their limitations. But it's not the story I want to tell today. For one, it's already been told extensively, written about in Vice, and discussed on countless other podcasts. Additionally, while it is certainly a feel-good story and a glimmer of hope in a dark situation, it's not really representative of the political or cultural reality in Palestine and Israel. For those of you not too familiar with the history of Israel and Palestine, the country of Israel did not exist until 1948. Until then, it was known as Mandatory Palestine, essentially acting as a British colony after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. During this period of British oversight, a Palestinian national movement of people who were living within the borders of the British Mandate began to take shape. "We are not Ottoman," said the leaders of this movement. "We are not British. We are not simply Arabs indistinguishable from other Arab countries. We have our own traditions, our own way of life that we have carried on for generations. We are Palestinian." At the same time, starting well before the Nazi Holocaust, I might add, the movement of Zionism was being born. Zionism called for the creation of a Jewish state in Mandatory Palestine, whose proponents saw Palestine as the Jewish ancestral homeland. And it certainly was an ancestral homeland. Their presence and subsequent expulsion from the region thousands of years ago is well documented in the historical and archaeological record. What is also well documented are the people who were living in the region at the start of the 20th century, at the time of Israel's creation. These people are Palestinians, and as Zionism was gaining traction among both diaspora Jews and the anti-Semitic governments of Western powers who were more than happy to support a movement that encouraged them to emigrate, Palestinian national identity in Palestine was growing stronger. In 1947, after several decades of increasing Zionist migration to Palestine, the newly formed United Nations voted on what became the Partition Plan, with 55% of the territory of Mandatory Palestine becoming the State of Israel. Arab leaders, seeing this as a theft of land, fought back. During this war, Zionist forces expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinian residents from its newly formed borders. For Israelis, this is now known as the Israeli War of Independence. For Palestinians, it's called the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. Now, personally, I'm not an expert on Israeli history. There's tons of great books on the subject, including many by both Israeli and Palestinian authors. I'm not here to relitigate the creation of Israel or the wars it fought, but I will say that when you forcibly, often violently, displace hundreds of thousands of people who were living on a patch of land for generations, you're bound to breed resistance. It's the most natural response in the world to mass displacement. And Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation and expansion over the years has taken many forms. There's armed resistance, of course. Older listeners to this podcast probably remember the PLO and the First and Second Intifada. And now there's no longer a PLO, but you still have violent resistance led by Hamas and groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But Palestinian resistance is not always just a military act. Sometimes it is also expressed culturally. The mere act of Palestinians expressing their culture publicly presents a threat to Israel, which has justified its existence using phrases like a land without people for a people without land, which was, of course, patently false. And one expression of Palestinian culture is the harvesting of herbs and plants that grow wild all over Israel and Palestine. Ariel Sharon, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture who would one day become prime minister, made the decision to ban the picking of an herb called za'atar in 1977 after realizing that this particular plant was especially important to the Palestinian identity. He had a scientific justification, of course. Ecologists and botanists had advised the Israel Nature and Parks Authority that za'atar was at risk of being over-harvested. But the justification, quite frankly, was flimsy. Palestinians had been harvesting this wild plant for centuries. None of the scientific claims made by these botanists were ever published in any kind of peer-reviewed or publicly available study. More likely than not, the scientific recommendations were simply a means of giving institutional legitimacy to quite literally criminalize Palestinian cuisine. The year prior, a Palestinian refugee camp near Beirut called Tel al-Za'atar, named after the herb, had been massacred by Israeli-aligned Christian militias during the Lebanese Civil War. Rumor has it that it was during this battle that Ariel Sharon realized the cultural importance of za'atar. And all he needed to do was leverage Israeli scientific institutions in order to ban this plant, which increasingly was becoming a symbol of Palestinian resistance. Sharon's decision to ban the picking of za'atar is a great example of a much broader phenomenon called greenwashing. Since the creation of Israel, the phrase "making the desert bloom" has been a consistent part of the country's national mythology, symbolizing the transformation of arid, uninhabitable desert into vibrant pine forests by way of Israeli tree planting campaigns. The problem, yet again, is that making the desert bloom is based on a lie. The idea that Palestine was a barren wasteland before Israeli settlement is just as unfounded as the idea that it was a land without people. The Israeli tree planting campaigns, led by a group called the Jewish National Fund, were primarily not about environmental restoration, but about transforming the land from something distinctly Palestinian into something distinctly Israeli. Oftentimes, these tree planting campaigns were explicitly targeted at turning old Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba into forests, so as to literally hide the country's ugly past. This is probably the most visible and horrifying example of greenwashing, but there are many more such examples, including the systematic destruction of Palestinian olive groves by settlers or Israeli security forces, with some of these groves going back hundreds of years. Within this context, it's easy to see how the banning of an herb used in Palestinian cuisine fits right into this pattern. And it isn't just that one herb that Israel has banned. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, now prime minister, added the vegetable akkoub to the list of plants whose foraging was now prohibited. Akkoub is often described as somewhere in flavor between an asparagus and an artichoke, and it's ubiquitous throughout Palestinian cuisine, particularly in the north. It also has a number of purported health benefits, including with liver disease, chest pain, heart problems, gastric pain, bronchitis, and even diabetes. In addition to banning akkoub, Sharon extended these anti-foraging policies to military law as well. Before 2005, the anti-foraging laws were pretty much exclusively enforced on Palestinian citizens of Israel living within Israeli borders. This is still wrong, of course. It's one of many tools Israel has used to keep its domestic Palestinian population living as second-class citizens, while the same laws are almost never enforced against Israelis. But starting in 2005, the prohibition of za'atar and akkoub could now be enforced in the West Bank, which I'll remind you, most of the international community does not recognize to be a part of Israel. And the enforcement in the West Bank, which is done in military courts, is often both harsher and less accountable. While Palestinian civilians of Israel would most likely just get slapped with a fine if caught foraging akkoub or za'atar, Palestinians in Palestine might get sent to prison. And there is some data on this. Between 2003 and 2019, there were 69 court decisions related to the picking of za'atar and akkoub within Israel proper. And all 69 of them, by the way, were Palestinians. None of the defendants were Jewish Israelis. In the West Bank, due to a lack of transparency, the data does not seem to exist, but there are still anecdotal accounts of these laws being enforced. In March 2021, Israeli settlers in the West Bank town of South Hebron spotted 5 boys between the ages of 8 and 13 picking akkoub, and told nearby Israeli soldiers, who went on to arrest the boys and drag them off into a detention facility, where they were interrogated for hours. While the IDF claims that the boys were attempting to steal a settler's exotic bird, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem published a video of the arrest. The video not only showed that they were picking akkoub, but that they were not in fact on private property when the settlers spotted them, chased them away, and reported them to the Israeli military. The boys were returned to their family the next day, but if it wasn't for the widely circulated video on social media, they may not have been so lucky. As of June 2024, there are over 200 Palestinian children held in Israeli jails, and Palestinian parents often have no recourse to see those children returned home. So at this point, let's stop and reflect on all of this. Some of you may still be thinking, Sky, this is interesting and all, but what does this have to do with drugs? Why are you talking about all this on a podcast that's ostensibly about psychoactive substances? And the answer to that question is that these laws that criminalize the picking of harmless herbs, they serve the exact same function as drug control laws throughout modern history. I'm sure that Israel would love to be able to use more traditional anti-drug policies to crack down on Palestine, but as it stands, that's not really viable because Palestinian culture is significantly more anti-drug than Israeli culture. There's obviously drug use in Palestine, there's drug use everywhere, and there's even a decent amount of psychedelic drug use in the Palestinian rave scene. But given that Hamas has gone as far as to ban the sale of alcohol in the Gaza Strip, there isn't really any way that Israel, whose drug laws are fairly liberal, there isn't really any way for them to use traditional drug policy to enforce their settler colonial agenda. But banning a culturally important plant and selectively enforcing that against a certain group of people has been used time and time again in drug enforcement. When American Indians were forced onto reservations at the end of the 19th century, and ceremonies using the psychedelic peyote cactus became a cultural totem of Indian identity, backlash from white legislators was swift. A bunch of people who'd never tried peyote and referred to it as dry whiskey, even though its effects are nothing like alcohol, nonetheless decided to ban its use in state after state and sent cops to raid meetings. Some Western botanists and explorers knew about peyote going back hundreds of years, of course, and Spanish settlers and missionaries as far back as the 16th century were certainly not thrilled with the ancient peyote rituals because they made it harder to assimilate local indigenous tribes into Catholicism. But it wasn't until Native Americans were forced onto reservations starting in the mid-1800s and continuing through the early 20th century that peyote became associated with the American Indian identity, and only then was there a strong backlash from state governments. I've talked about this on my peyote episode, which you should listen to if you haven't yet, but until the late 1800s, there wasn't really such a thing as Indian identity. Indians was just the label American settlers used to describe its indigenous population, but there was absolutely nothing that someone from Navajo Nation would likely feel they had in common with a Lakota person thousands of miles away. As such, there was no Indian culture or Indian identity until America created it through force, more specifically, through genocide. And peyote was not just a piece of cultural identity, but a symbol of indigenous resistance to that genocide, when all other avenues of resistance had been stamped out. Peyote was a way to keep ancient traditions alive and offer inner liberation to an oppressed people for whom all other attempts at liberation had ended in mass slaughter. For Palestinians, za'atar and akkoub have similarly become cultural acts of resistance for a people oppressed. Not just resistance, but connection to a land they refuse to be displaced from. Speaking of his immovability and his steadfast desire to remain on his ancestral land, one Palestinian man declared in an interview recently, "We don't need money. I can live with my children and my wife and eat only za'atar." An akkoub, harvested only in spring, has often been used by Palestinians to track the seasons. The famous Palestinian poet Fadwa Tuqan wrote that her mother never knew her exact birthday, only that she was cooking akkoub when she went into labor. For many Palestinians, to be Palestinian is to eat za'atar, to mark the passage of time with akkoub, and to be inseparable from the land you were born on and the food that grows there. And like with peyote, the people who banned these plants, especially in the case of akkoub, know virtually nothing about it. Akkoub is a staple of northern Palestinian cuisine, but it is almost never used in Israel. And there is no scientific or environmental justification for banning the plant, nothing that's ever been published at least. But to the extent that either of these plants are actually endangered, a hell of a lot more of it has been destroyed by Israeli expansion than by Palestinian overharvesting. One Israeli botanist named Nativ Jadai made this exact point. He said, "No one talks about the fact that we, the Jewish Israelis, destroy much more za'atar than the Arabs pick. Do you know how many great za'atar populations were uprooted by bulldozers? Locations with beautiful amounts of za'atar, and all of it is now gone. But the Arab, he picks 5 kilograms and gets a fine." This greenwashing, the use of environmentalism to justify oppressive policies, is another tactic employed around the world by drug prohibitionists. In Myanmar, officials have justified anti-opium laws by invoking the environmental harm caused by slash-and-burn agriculture, despite the fact that slash-and-burn is used in a wide variety of industries. Is it bad? Absolutely. More than 40,000 hectares of land were used for growing opium poppies in 2022. I would never claim that this is good for the environment, but this is a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of deforestation caused by rice farming. Rice is Myanmar's largest agricultural industry, which also uses slash-and-burn agriculture extensively. But nobody has tried to ban rice farming because rice, for many reasons, is not seen as a drug. You see the exact same patterns of greenwashing used in coca-growing countries such as Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Coca, the leafy bush out of which cocaine can be produced, has been grown by indigenous people in the regions for centuries, but its farming has been heavily regulated and often violently cracked down on by Latin American countries trying to comply with international narcotics treaties. And again, it is true that the coca industry, particularly in mountainous regions of the Andes where other agriculture would not be possible, contributes to deforestation. And the production of cocaine paste from these leaves is harmful in all sorts of ways as well, releases tons of chemicals. But the impact of coca growing itself is a drop in the bucket compared to logging and cattle grazing, which have decimated the Amazon in a way that coca could only dream of doing. And if you listen to the very first episode of Drug Cultures I ever did, you'll see that greenwashing of drug prohibition is being done right now in Yemen as well. In Yemen, there's a plant called khat, chewed by more than half the population, addictive but otherwise fairly benign. And yet if I look it up on Google, I will find a pileup of frantic articles from The Economist or Time magazine about how khat is not only making Yemeni men more violent, but is also the reason Yemen is going to be the first country in the world to run out of water. Which is scary, right? It is. But many of these exact same publications have no words of condemnation for when our great ally Saudi Arabia bombs critical water infrastructure, including desalination plants. No, their only recommendation is for Yemen to stop growing khat and start growing coffee, which is also water intensive and also not a food crop. But we don't respect khat growing as a valid enterprise in the same way that we respect coffee growing. We only see it through its environmental impact. And that's what it really means for something to be a drug in the political sense. It is a symbol of a product or activity not respected by whatever the power structure in a given place might be, seen only through its deleterious effects on the individual and the environment. It doesn't matter if that product is essential to the cultural identity of the people who live there. For some Yemeni men in particular, a wedding or celebration without khat is considered un-Yemeni. And for some Palestinians, a kitchen whose spice rack doesn't have za'atar is not truly a Palestinian kitchen. But if the very existence of a culture is an impediment to your political project, then turning something into a drug and restricting it is a great way to consolidate your own cultural and political power at the expense of the other. In America, it's actually quite obvious that our laws are not set up to protect people from the dangers of drug use, but to use drugs as an excuse to target specific communities. In fact, a former Nixon aide admitted publicly that Nixon's war on drugs was never actually about the drugs, but about making an excuse to criminalize and raid the meetings of the black community and the anti-war left. And just as American drug laws that were ostensibly designed to punish large-scale drug trafficking end up frequently ruining the lives of low-level users, so too do the anti-foraging laws. Ostensibly, these laws are in place to stop large-scale commercial harvesting operations that could wreak havoc on local ecosystems, but they can just as easily be weaponized by angry settlers to ruin the lives of Palestinian children. As one Israel Nature and Parks Association employee said, "How can we know whether these 10 women in the valley all work for one man, who goes to sell them in the market, or whether they are just picking a basket to feed their family?" Now, when I hear this, I think, what does it matter if they're foraging with the intent to sell? What they're doing shouldn't be a crime. But once you buy into the paternalistic logic that Israel needs to protect Palestinians and their land from themselves, it's easy to see how any amount of brutality can be justified. And I'm not trying to make an essentialist argument about all Israelis here. That couldn't be further from the truth. There are many thousands of brave Israelis who are seeing through the jingoism and the national fervor and speaking up against their government's genocide, often at great social cost. One of these people is Lior Roseman, the Israeli researcher behind the ayahuasca and peacebuilding studies, whose outspoken support for Palestinian liberation lands him outside of the mainstream when it comes to Israeli scientists. When I was researching for this podcast, I came across a fascinating article he wrote back in 2021 called On Revelations and Revolutions: Drinking Ayahuasca Among Palestinians Under Israeli Occupation. The part that particularly caught my attention was his section about the Palestinian perspective on shared ayahuasca ceremonies with Israelis. Of these Palestinian participants, he writes, their access to ayahuasca practices has been mediated through Jewish-Israeli circles. While many Israelis travel to South America on post-military service journeys, during which time they become acquainted with globalized ayahuasca networks, Palestinians have been much more restricted in their international movement. This is owing mainly to their relatively lower socioeconomic status and travel restrictions imposed on Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians who joined the Israeli rituals were a small minority as well as less experienced. Therefore, they often had to rely for support on Jewish Israeli group organizers, facilitators, musicians, helpers, and participants. In addition, some of the sites where the rituals took place were at homes and on land confiscated from Palestinians by the Israeli state and redistributed to Jewish Israelis. Now think for 1 second about just how messed up that one thing is, that these were homes that used to be Palestinian homes in some cases, that were taken from Palestinians and given to Israelis, and then they went on to be the places where these ceremonies that are supposed to be healing ceremonies that bring Israelis and Palestinians together, and they're literally in stolen houses. Anyway, he goes on. As the mother tongue of Jewish Israeli participants, Hebrew was the main language spoken during these rituals, yet for Palestinians, it was a second language after Arabic, or a third after English. He goes on to write about how all of the songs at these ceremonies are Israeli songs, many of them about the Holocaust or other important pieces of Jewish history, and that while Palestinians were allowed and encouraged to feel and express their political anger if it arose during the ceremony, that political anger was often framed as shadow work by the Israeli facilitators, something to overcome as an individual instead of through a shared struggle for collective liberation. While these ceremonies were studied as a potential peace-building tool to break down cultural barriers between the two groups, they're fundamentally Israeli cultural spaces. Which is why I wanted to do an episode about za'atar and akkoub, two pillars of Palestinian cuisine and thus culture. In the context of everything else going on in the region, it's reasonable to wonder why any of this matters in the big picture. It's not as if za'atar and akkoub are essential to survival, although akkoub in particular does have significant nutritional and even medical utility. If you go to jail for picking non-essential herbs and plants, why do it at all? Well, I can't speak personally on the subject. I'm not Palestinian. All I can do is listen to what Palestinians say and read what they write. When you look at the horrors that have unfolded in the last year throughout Palestine, particularly in Gaza, which has been under constant siege and bombardment, it almost seems trivial to focus on the criminalization of foraging. What does it matter whether or not Palestinians can pick za'atar when they cannot buy bread because there are no longer any functioning bakeries? What does it matter the health benefits of akkoub when every single hospital in the Gaza Strip has either been damaged or destroyed by Israeli airstrikes? Every single college and university in Gaza has been destroyed. Some 80% of residential buildings have been destroyed. Some 90% of Gaza's residents have been displaced at least once. And while the official death toll sits at around 40 or 50,000, a study from The Lancet in July put the actual death toll at closer to 186,000. If this verifies, that's 8% of the population of the Gaza Strip. That level of death and horror is just truly impossible to wrap your mind around. And it's exactly in the context of this horror and this heartbreak that it's more important than ever to talk about preserving Palestinian culture in all of its forms, so that after this senseless slaughter comes to an end, the real work of peace building on a level playing field can hopefully begin. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is Drug Cultures. Thanks for listening.